This is Corey Franklin with obitpage.com from Chicago, featuring people who've died recently who figure prominently in history and society. Tonight we're going to start out with Dr. Ernest McCulloch, who died recently. Dr. McCulloch was a medical doctor from Canada, and with his companion, Dr. James Till, who was a radiation biologist, they discovered the stem cell. And it was their work that led to the first bone marrow transplants in the world. This is 50 years ago. They were doing their research. Their first papers came out. This was maybe a decade after World War II had ended, after the Hiroshima explosions and Nagasaki explosions, and people understood that radiation could wipe out blood cells, but with transplants of certain cells, they might recover. Doctors McCulloch and Till were looking essentially for a cure for acute myelogenous leukemia, and it was their genius to use radiated mice and take their cells, replant them, and to recover the stem cells, the cells that were the progenitors of all the blood cells in the body. This work led to the first bone marrow transplants, which indeed were something of a cure for many of our leukemias, and also the identification of the stem cell led to the realization that we might be able to grow other parts or to regenerate things like neurons and other diseased or damaged tissues. So they are among Canada's greatest medical discoverers, and here is Dr. McCulloch telling part of the story along with Dr. Till and some of their co-workers.
I was going to be an aviator, I was going to be a policeman, I had all the usual kinds of aspirations that children have, and then sometime in the mid-teens, I decided on medicine for a very foolish reason. It struck me that the great advantage of being a doctor was you were your own boss, and I liked that idea. I met Dr. Till briefly when he was at the Clonal labs, but I got to know him much more when we moved into the Ontario Cancer Institute on Sherbourne Street, and I was going to use radiation to prepare mice to be recipients for bone marrow transplantation. Dr. Johns had a rule that said that only physicists could use radiation. Dr. Till volunteered to be the physicist, and we never looked back.
Here's Dr. Till discussing their collaboration.
We developed a genuine collaboration where we talked on equal terms about what kinds of experiments we thought we'd like to do and which ones should be done, instead of me helping him or some sort of temporary arrangement. We didn't think of it as temporary, and of course we got along very well, which I found him, and I still do, an original mind.
I think we had different approaches, but they were complementary, and we knew that when we disagreed, that the right answer was something different. The assay is quite a simple one. You prepare animals as recipients with a large dose of radiation, and then you inject normal marrow cells into them. And if you inject in a small number of marrow cells, much smaller than is usual, and examine the spleens of the animals after 10 to 14 days, it's obvious that the spleens have lumps. And the important thing that we did was to count the lumps and determine that there was a linear relationship, a straight line relationship between the number of cells that were injected and the number of lumps.
Till explains the importance of these lumps.
And we thought of them as colonies of cells rather than local areas of regeneration.
One of their companions explains the importance of these local colonies of cells.
More importantly, they could also look at these colonies histologically through the way people had always looked at blood cells and say, there are red blood cells in the colony, there are white blood cells in the colony, there are neutrophils, there are lymphocytes. Therefore, the one stem cell that lodged into the spleen in this site must have created all of those different cell types, which means that it's not one stem cell for neutrophils, one stem cell for red cells. It's one stem cell that can make all cell types. If I'd just done an experiment and it had a tremendous result and I was excited about it, and as soon as I had talked to Jim Till about it and got his agreement as to how the benefit of his understanding as to what this all means, it was fun to go to McCulloch because he would start with that result and project 10 years into the future. Well, if that's true, then this is what should happen. And way down the road, we should be able to do this and this and this. And he would, just thinking on his feet, design experiments that maybe nobody would do for 5 years, but he would think of them on the spot.
James Tillon being elected to the Canadian Medical Hall of Fame with Ernest McCulloch.
Delighted that my colleague Ernest McCulloch is entering. He is a medical person, and it is a highly appropriate recognition for him. And so it's also a delight to be with him. I mean, to come into the Hall of Fame at the same time, because our names have been linked together so much and for so long. It's nice to be together in this particular time.
Dr. McCulloch and Dr. Till never won the Nobel Prize in Medicine. Perhaps they should have. I mean, for identifying the concept of the stem cell, they've broken ground in all the research that will come in the future for things like spinal cord injuries and neurologic diseases. They did not work in embryonic stem cell research. They didn't get involved in that controversy, but their work was essential to that area, which is so important today. Here's a final story about Dr. McCulloch, which will tell you what kind of person he was, from a student of his.
When I was a summer student, I gave a talk on my work, and he asked if I had ever read the works of Shaw, The Doctor's Dilemma by George Bernard Shaw. And I said I hadn't, and he said, I recommend that you read it. And of course, I read the whole play, and there was one line that was relevant to what my talk was about. He was extremely well-read, extremely interested in the world around him, and challenged the young people around him to think likewise.
Dr. Ernest McCulloch. I'd like to talk about Emory Bellard, who died recently. And if you're not a football fan, you're not going to know who Emory Bellard is. And the thing is, even if you are a football fan, you probably won't know who Emory Bellard is. But he was a revolutionary figure in football. He was a Texas high school coach. And as we've said before, there are two sports in Texas, football and spring football. And he was very successful at the high school level. And in the mid-'60s, the coach of the University of Texas, Darrell Royal, asked him to be on his staff. University of Texas had won the national championship in 1963, and they had a couple of down years for them being 4 losses a year in the mid-'60s. And Emory Bellard was asked as an offensive coordinator to develop a new offense. Emory Bellard is the man who developed the wishbone offense. Wishbone offense with a quarterback and 3 backs, and it basically gives the quarterback the option to run, throw, or pitch. And he instituted the wishbone offense at the University of Texas. They lost the first game where they had it in 1968. They tied the second game where they had it, and then they went on to win 30 games in a row with it. They won the 1969 national championship, and after that, everybody wanted to know from Darrell Royal how to run the wishbone offense. Here is the offensive coordinator at the University of Alabama, which picked up the wishbone offense from Texas. Coach Bryant is, of course, the legend Bear Bryant.
When we went to the wishbone, I was in that position. And I believe this was the 71 season that we were going to the wishbone. And it was a time, I think, that in our history where this was a very crucial decision that Coach Bryant made and made alone. And he, in his friendship with Darrell Royal and the time that he spent with him after our spring training the year before, where we spent all of our time in a pro set, passing, throwing the ball a lot. I think from that time until, say, July, latter part of July, right before the start of practice, Coach Bryant had made his mind up that we couldn't win throwing the ball with our personnel, that we had to go to the wishbone. And I think he took this approach so that it would be be as secretive about it as possible. He told the staff, I believe around the 27th, 28th of July, that we were going to open the season against Southern Cal in the Coliseum in the wishbone offense. And we were going to close the season in Legion Field against Auburn in the wishbone offense. We wouldn't get 2 or 3 games into the season and decide we couldn't make it work. His words were we were going to sink or swim with the wishbone. But I think football clinic that we had back then, we had the state all-star football game and basketball game at the Coliseum. We would have 1,000 high school coaches or so come in for the clinic. Coach Royal was invited, had been invited for quite a while to speak at this clinic. He had just won the national championship in the wishbone. We never had time to make a playbook before the start of practice. We went undefeated that year in the wishbone, and Coach Bryant was very superstitious, so he didn't want a playbook ever made. So we went 11 years without an offensive playbook, simply because of his superstition in this regard. But the wishbone offense is a great offense, and it fit Alabama at that time. I think in the 70s, we were the first team in the history of the NCAA to win 100 games. We won 103 games in 10 years. Fun offense to coach. It took place at a time where we got away with it for that length of time. Rules changed in the NCAA with the way you block, the use of your hands, that kind of took us out of it in order to recruit linemen, to recruit quarterbacks. But I wouldn't take anything in the world for those years.
Based on the strength of his reputation with the wishbone, Coach Bellard became the head coach at Texas A&M and actually coached them very well for a couple of years. They were ranked number 6 in the country. He had 2 devastating losses in a row, and they were so devastating to him that he retired from coaching college football, went back to coaching high school football, and was very successful for the rest of his career and became a legend because of the wishbone. Ironically, Texas continued to run the wishbone, and their big rival Oklahoma was failing to them so many times that their coaches came to Texas to see would they teach them the wishbone, and Darrell Royal, probably against his better judgment, taught them the wishbone, and Oklahoma became the most successful football team of the late 70s and early 80s based on this. One of the things that this did was it placed a premium on speed and timing, and it made a lot of the coaches, including Coach Bellard, coach and recruit more black players. Emory Bellard was one of the first Texas coaches to recruit black players, in large measure because he realized that their talents would augment the wishbone. As the Alabama coach said, rules changed. They wanted more passing. It's not exactly a passing offense. Rules for linemen changed. Today you can't play the wishbone too much in the pros because the linemen and linebackers are so quick and quarterbacks are so valuable. But every once in a while you will see a pro team run a couple of plays with a wishbone type offense, and it's still used at the college level very successfully at places like Navy. So we say goodbye to Emory Bellard, who was one of the geniuses of college football and created an offense that dominated college football for more than a generation. Coach Bellard died of ALS, and he was very frail, but before he died, they held a ceremony for him at Texas A&M in front of 50,000 people.
The championships in 1958 and 59 at Breckenridge High School, and again in 1966 at San Angelo Central. Before coming to A&M, he served as an assistant coach under Darrell Royal at Texas, and is credited as the inventor of the wishbone formation. He retired from coaching in January of 1995 with a career record of 170 wins, 53 losses, and 9 ties on the high school level, and 83 and 69 on the collegiate level, and was inducted that same year into the Texas Sports Hall of Fame. Ladies and gentlemen, head coach Emory Ballard.
Finally tonight, it hasn't been a good period of time for Irish rock musicians. We lost Jerry Rafferty a couple of weeks ago, and we recently lost Gary Moore, who died of a heart attack at age 58. Gary Moore was a child prodigy on the guitar. He was a rock guitarist, and as a young man, someone from Fleetwood Mac heard him, gave him a Les Paul guitar, and from there he took off. He took over for Eric Clapton when Eric Clapton left Cream, when he played with Ginger Baker and Jack Bruce. He's best known in the United States for playing with Thin Lizzy, and he also played with Greg Lake and a number of other British groups. He was an extremely talented guitarist, started at an early age, and developed a fantastic reputation. He could play rock and blues equally well, and here he talks about his beginnings as a guitarist as a young boy.
I loved the sound of the guitar, and my dad used to be a promoter in Northern Ireland, which I grew up in Belfast. He had a dance hall about 10 miles away, and he used to take me to see these bands play there. So I fell in love with the guitar just through that, and it was always in my head when I was at school. And I used to get slapped around at school all the time because the teacher would come up. One of my teachers, I think, was telepathic because he said to me, "Are you sitting there thinking about playing a great big red guitar or something?" And I thought, how does he know that? I was like, well, are you sitting there thinking about playing the guitar? Yeah, actually I am, while you're slapping me around,
Here's Greg Lake, who was looking for a new guitarist after Emerson, Lake, and Palmer broke up, and he approached Gary Moore.
We're recording at Abbey Road, and he walked in. I'll never forget, he had a full-length leather coat on. He came in and he said hello, and he went straight out in the studio, put his guitar on, didn't even take his coat off, and he started to play, and immediately everyone in the room just went, whoa. It was unbelievable. I mean, the sheer energy that he could generate. He just instinctively played through it, and it's still on the album today. Gary's guitar, every time I would see him, when we were on tour, he'd have a guitar in his hands. And when you try and talk to him, he'd be playing. And it used to almost get to the point where, he'd say, look, Gary, can you stop playing for a moment? Because we need to talk to you about something. It doesn't matter if you're left or to the right. And one day I remember he said, Greg, you know what? If I walked into a hotel room and on the bed there was Sharon Stone and a Fender Stratocaster, I'd pick up the Stratocaster. That was Gary. He lived for guitar. I think that he certainly was amongst the top three players. You're talking about Jeff Beck, Gary Moore, Mark Knopfler. He was amongst those finest players in the world. If you say guitar, the word Gary Moore immediately comes to mind. He was a master of the instrument.
We're going to close tonight with a little bit of Gary Moore's biggest hit in the United States with Thin Lizzy, The Boys Are Back in Town. See you next week.
Guess you just got back today. Right out bullshit up the other way. Haven't changed that much to say. Still think those catching me. We're asking to fool around. Where you were, tell you could be found. Told them you were living downtown. Coming on the old man's weekend. Come on. Boys are back in town. 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 Boys are back in town.